Day. The last 24 hours have been a quieter time on the Ukrainian battlefields. This is partly perhaps explained by the change in the weather. It seems that once again we're in time of rains, and there's already been articles apparently in the American media about Ukrainian soldiers complaining that their equipment, the Western tanks and armoured vehicles, are too heavy, that they're unsuitable for operation in the kind of conditions that they're now fighting in the steppe lands of, well, depending on your choice, southern Ukraine or western Russia. But anyway, whatever the facts are, for the moment, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of fighting. There's been a great deal of shelling, but no really sustained attempts by Ukraine over the last 24 hours to renew the big attacks that it has been launching over the previous days. That's not to say that there hasn't been some fighting. It seems that on one part of the battlefront, and I'm not going to pretend that I know exactly which part, but my sense is that it's somewhat further to the west of some of the fighting that's been going on. Ukraine has occupied apparently 3 villages, which until fairly recently were in what is called the grey zone, no man's land. The most important of these is a place called Lobkovia. These are all very small places, and apparently they're now deserted. They've been fought over, or rather, to be more precise, they've exchanged hands several times over the last week. The Russians occupied them before the offensive. It seems that the number of troops they positioned in them was always quite small, and the main Russian defences in this area are apparently on higher ground further south. Higher ground, I suspect, is a relative matter in the steppe lands, but anyway, it doesn't seem to be, at least as far as I can see, a particularly important battle, and the number of men involved on either side seems to have been small, perhaps 100, perhaps a bit more. Anyway, that's the only movement on the battlefronts. Otherwise, as I said, it's heavy shelling. It's the kind of movement, by the way, which I suspect in the pre-internet age, most people wouldn't have even known about in the event of a battle like this. So we could say for the moment that after 7 days, Ukraine has not achieved anything significant in its offensive. Now, it needs to be stressed again that this is only the first week of the offensive, as Vladimir Putin reminded us yesterday, and as several other people have pointed out. Most of the Ukrainian military that has been assigned to this offensive is still there, and of course the Ukrainians are now very busy attempting to reinforce their forces. And in fact, what General Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, said a few days ago, as I said, has turned out to be correct, in the sense that Ukraine has indeed withdrawn most of its troops from Kherson region and is now concentrating them in Zaporozhye. And there are other reports. Boris Rozhin, otherwise known as Colonel Kassad, has provided various details of other Ukrainian troops being allocated, reassigned to various parts of the battlefronts to make up for the heavy losses that have been experienced over the last couple of days. It bears repeating again that all the fighting we have seen up to this point is not in those great fortified lines that the Russians constructed over the course of the autumn, winter and spring, but in territory well ahead of it, well to the north of it, in territory which the Russians basically, I think, consider as a kind of control or buffer zone. Now, I'm not an expert in these matters, but it all does remind me of something that happened back, I think, in January, when the Russians launched a series of advances in this particular area, which some people, myself to some extent briefly, thought might be the start of a Russian winter offensive. The Russians seem to be pushing towards Orechov and other places, including a town whose name I've forgotten, by the way, on the Dnieper, on the Dnieper River, further west. And for a time, there was even some talk that the Russians were intending to march and advance all the way to Zaporozhye. Anyway, they then reached Orechov, the outskirts of Orechov. There was some talk that they would be going to try to encircle it, but they never really seem to have attempted to do that. And at that point, this Russian advance stopped. Now, I have come to the view that this was never intended as a serious offensive. What the Russians were doing was something that Brian Beletic talked about, I remember at the time. They were advancing their zone of control north of their great fortified lines to the south, and they probably used the intervening weeks from their advance until today to lay this complex set of minefields which have been causing the Ukrainians so much trouble. Now, I would say there's been some pushback to the arguments made by Simplicius the thinker about the tactics Ukraine has used in trying to cross these minefields. Simplicius the thinker says that the approach Ukraine has taken is, in its own sense, rational, in the sense that Ukraine has no realistic choice, given the density of the minefields, to basically follow a vehicle, to have these carefully bunched units following behind vehicles with mine plows, despite the risk, the enormous risk of exposure to attack from Russian artillery, helicopter gunships, and all that kind of thing. Well, Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama has disputed this. He said that what Ukraine is doing is completely contrary to military doctrine. And a former NATO official has, in fact, corresponded with me in private, and he's provided some details about both NATO doctrine and how to cross minefields, and Russian doctrine or Soviet doctrine about how to traverse minefields. And without going into too much detail, it doesn't seem to me as if the Ukrainians are doing any of the things that either of these two doctrinal theories, the Western one or the Russian one, describe. An important point about these doctrines, it must be said, is that there's been an assumption on both the Western, the NATO, and the Soviet side that the attacking force would have preponderance in terms of artillery in order to pin down the adversary army, and, well, would either have air superiority with NATO operations. That appears to be a constantly operating presumption, or would at least have some ability to challenge the adversary's attempt to use its air force to interfere with these operations, which is perhaps closer to Soviet thinking. And this person has pointed out to me that obviously this is not the case. Neither is the case in this conflict. And he's wondered why an offensive is taking place in this area at all. He appears to think that the human costs involved in trying to cross minefields in the kind of way the Ukrainians are doing, breaching all doctrinal policies, well, that is a very serious mistake. And I have no reason to doubt this. I'm sure he's absolutely right. But then that takes us back to what Simplicius the thinker was saying in his piece 2 days ago, which is what realistic choice does Ukraine have? It's under enormous pressure politically from its Western sponsors to launch an offensive and to regain some territory. So it's had to launch this offensive. There is no other realistic place where it can launch an offensive and achieve a successful outcome. So it is having to do this here, despite all the minefields. And coming back to what Putin was saying the other day, yesterday, it's not implausible that at some point, in fact it's likely, and I think people ought to be prepared for that at some point the Ukrainians will be able to get past these particular set of minefields and then reach the first real Russian fortified line. And then, of course, if they breach that one, there are apparently at least 2 others beyond that, and then beyond those 2 fortified lines, the Russians apparently have a substantial reserve. Well, we'll see what happens. But for the moment, as I said, it doesn't seem as if they've achieved very much, and it does seem as if their losses are extremely high. Now, there is, it must be said, quite a lot of commentary about what is going on in the media. And it's very interesting to see that for once, there is a clear divergence between the way in which the media in Germany and the media in the United States are covering this Ukrainian offensive and the way in which the media in Britain is doing so. The media in Britain continues to take the view that Ukraine is advancing purposefully, remorselessly, irresistibly, that it's going from one victory to another, and that all is well with this offensive. For me, it was typified by the comment that Reuters made about Putin's comments of yesterday. Putin said in his comments that yes, Ukraine's offensive is indeed underway, but he said that so far Ukraine has made no progress, and that is fundamentally true. And Reuters said that Putin has covered it by saying that Putin has provided no evidence that Ukraine has failed to make progress, which to me comes very close to demanding that Putin prove a negative, prove that Ukraine is not making progress, as opposed to proving that Ukraine is making progress. Now, this is very typical of the whole approach that the entire British media has been taking to this war. Every Ukrainian advance is hailed as a great victory. I'm confident, by the way, that we will be hearing about the capture of these 3 deserted villages as some great victory, comparable to, well, whatever. And every Russian victory, by contrast, like Bakhmut, is turned on its head and made to appear like a defeat, so that the fact that Bakhmut was captured, some parts of the British media have yet fully to acknowledge the fact that that has even happened, but to the extent that they have done, it's a strategic victory for Ukraine because of the enormous losses the Russians are supposed to have suffered in the battle to capture Bakhmut. So that's the British approach. In the United States, there is, I think, a slightly more nuanced coverage It is there being widely acknowledged that Ukraine has suffered very severe losses in these attacks, especially, by the way, in material. The Russian Defense Ministry provides information every day about the number of Ukrainian soldiers who have been killed in the fighting, killed or wounded in the fighting. It is indeed high, but it is the equipment losses that seem to stand out. And by the way, every day we now have more pictures of Leopard 2s or Bradley infantry fighting vehicles being destroyed in the fighting. And clearly, in the United States, some of these pictures have been shown. They've not been shown to anything like the same extent, by the way, in the British media. And I've noticed that the German media is also sounding rather more glum about the prospects of this offensive than perhaps it might have done. BITCHUTE has basically admitted that the Russians are putting up a stubborn and fierce resistance, and that the war could go on for years, certainly beyond 2023. And the New York Times, by the way, has also written a piece which appears to acknowledge the same thing. So there's a divergence in media coverage of the war. Now, I think that perhaps is explained by the relative remoteness of each of these three parties from the battle. Now, Germany is much closer to Russia. Until recently, it had a very strong economic relationship with Russia. It's got, within Germany, political parties, the AfD and Die Linke, who are openly critical of the way in which the German government has supported the United States in this conflict, and who have been calling for some kind of diplomatic compromise. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, has had to give assurances that he's intending to speak to Putin fairly soon. And one can sense that in Germany there is at least some manifestations of disquiet and some criticism and some demands that this be approached in a different way. And that has fed its way into the media and explains in part why some parts of the German media are prepared to concede that things up to this point have not been going especially well. Well, that's Germany. The United States is much more interesting because in the United States, the issue is more an elite one. Now, John Helmer has written a very fine piece, Dancing with Bears, in which he's made, I think it's a valid point, there is growing skepticism amongst a large part of the American public about the war, but it is nonetheless far away. American soldiers themselves are not directly involved, or at least not to the extent that perhaps would make the American people so far aware. So it's an uncomfortable, difficult thing that is rumbling away on the horizon. The US is much more remote to this than, say, Germany is. But the United States is a superpower. And as a superpower, it has global commitments. And it is the people who are responsible for ensuring US success in those commitments who are becoming concerned and who are making their concerns increasingly open. We've been hearing a lot over the last few months about the depletion of US arsenals, the enormous difficulties the United States has replenishing them, the way that is weakening the US force posture around the world, and there's growing evidence that officials in the US government at multiple levels are becoming increasingly concerned. Now, I'm going to come to that in more detail shortly. But if we go to Britain, it seems to me that Britain is in the same position in terms of public feeling as the United States is, in the sense that I don't think the British public is tremendously enthusiastic about this war. It's again become, as it is in the United States, difficult and perhaps not always very attractive background music. I get the sense that there's more skepticism about the war and about Ukraine than there was this time last year, for example. But one can't really say that there are enormous cracks on the part of either the political class or the electorate, because the war, so far at least, remains a relatively distant affair. And at the same time, in Britain, we are not a superpower. Britain is not a superpower like the United States, provided it can engage in this conflict from a distance, hiding behind the US's skirts if anything goes wrong. I think that the British political class are not too bothered. As I've said in the past, in some ways it serves their purpose at a time of deep economic and social malaise in Britain. It enables the political class to maintain its inner discipline, and it also enables it to isolate and criticize any of its opponents as being pro-Russian. So that, I think, partly accounts for the differences in media coverage of this war. In the United States and in Germany, an awful lot more is at stake than is the case in Britain. And to get a sense of how far things are becoming, shall we say, difficult in the United States, we should go perhaps to a fascinating article pointed out to me by Garland Nixon, to whom I thank, and it's in Politico, and a magazine which appears to be used increasingly as the sounding board for arguments and conflicts within the administration. And the article reads, "The Pentagon is freaking out about a potential war with China," and then there's in brackets the subtitle, "Because America might lose." And then there's lots of scenarios about how such a war could be fought, but we then get to the parts of it that really relate to the problem of Ukraine. And one gets this, paragraphs like this: "The problem has come into sharp relief only in the last few years as Russia invaded Ukraine, leading to a prolonged war that has drained US munitions stockpiles, and China dramatically escalated both its military spending and aggressive rhetoric about Taiwan. In the last year, the US has allocated nearly $50 billion in security aid to Kiev, possibly cutting further into its deterrent against China. In other words, the failure to deter Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine and the stress this has put on the US defense industrial base should be sounding alarms for the US military posture vis-a-vis Taiwan, many defense experts say. Yet critics on both sides of the aisle say the Biden administration has been slow to respond to what is minimally required to prevent an Indo-Pacific catastrophe, which is the need to rapidly build up a better deterrent, especially new stockpiles of munitions that would convince China it would be too costly to attack Taiwan. And then we hear all kinds of problems, and we hear that there is recognition of the challenge that goes to the top of the Pentagon, but across the board there is more talk than action. And this is said by somebody called Seth Jones, a former Obama-era defense official. And we also hear alarm about the state of the US military-industrial complex. A swift response may not be possible, in large part because of how shrunken the US manufacturing base has become since the Cold War. All of a sudden, Washington is reckoning with the fact that so many parts and pieces of munitions, planes and ships it needs are being manufactured overseas, including in China. Among the deficiencies, components of solid rocket motors, shell casings, machine tools, fuses, and precursor instruments to propellants and explosives, many of which are made in China and India. Beyond that, skilled labor is sorely lacking and the learning curve is steep. The US has slashed defense workers to a third of what they were in 1985 and seen some 17,000 companies leave the industry. And we go on to read that unfortunately the more you dig under the hood, the more problems you see, said a senior Democratic defense expert in the Senate who was granted anonymity because he was not allowed to speak on the record for his boss. And there's much more of this. And then we read that it's proving extremely difficult to get the administration to pay any attention. It's not said why, but we'll come to the reason why shortly. But we read, for example, that Mike Gallagher, Representative Mike Gallagher, Republican from Wisconsin, chair of the Select Committee, this is presumably a House committee, speaks about the urgent task is to manufacture and move massive numbers of missiles and other high-tech munitions to East Asia to shore up the US deterrent against China. What is needed, most needed, far more joint air-to-surface standoff missiles, long-range anti-ship missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles, and other munitions. Gallagher said, "You need this to be prioritized at the Defense Secretary level," Gallagher told me in an interview in early May. But when Gallagher asked Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin questions about Taiwan's defense at a recent hearing, he couldn't really answer, Gallagher said. "I asked Austin point blank, what is your highest priority?" And he responded with all this jargon about readiness levels. And the fundamental problem is that with all of these shortages and deficiencies in the US defense system, what the United States needs to do, if it is to present what these people who we've just been hearing making all of these complaints talk about, posing a credible deterrent to China. We'll come to what they actually mean in a moment. What they're saying is that, in effect, the United States needs to husband whatever it has, build up its industries, not allow itself to be diverted from the tasks in hand by secondary issues. China's military is building up at a very rapid speed. Every single war game that the Pentagon has conducted, this is mentioned in this article, relating to a conflict between the US and China over Taiwan, has ended in a Chinese victory. And at the moment, the US doesn't have the forces to respond or to change the balance. So they need to focus on their situation in the Pacific against China, Taiwan, and all of that. And what they're doing instead is that they're struggling to keep Ukraine equipped. They're focused instead on Ukraine, and they're letting the situation in the Pacific slide. And there is no real situation in which this can change. We hear that Christian Brose, former senior UN aide to the late Senator McCain, hardly a dove, says that we could throw $1 trillion a year at the defense budget now, and we're not going to get a meaningful increase in traditional military capabilities in the next 5 years. They cannot be produced. It is as simple as that. And the reason is China and other countries, not all of them friendly, make and supply a lot of stuff now. Over decades of what many say was delusional thinking by both political parties about turning China into a friendly stakeholder, Washington heedlessly ceded shipbuilding, aircrafts, and circuit boards over to China and other cheap overseas labour forces. America's new F-35 fighter jets contain a magnet component made with an alloy almost exclusively manufactured in China. China also totally dominates machine tools and rare earth metals essential for manufacturing missiles and munitions, as well as lithium used in batteries, cobalt, and the aluminium and titanium used in semiconductors. Whilst Beijing has made new advances in explosives, most American military explosives are made at a single aging army plant in Tennessee. Whilst they were industrializing, we were deindustrializing, said Brose. Today, China commands some 45% to 50% of total shipbuilding globally, whilst the United States has less than 1%. Given those numbers, explain to me how the United States is going to win a traditional shipbuilding race with China. So, this is the picture. Now, can I make immediately a number of observations about this? It's a fundamental illusion to think that in Washington there is a peace party pitted against a war party. Certainly there are some people who are perhaps more realistic about the state of things than others. These are the realists I often talk about. In my opinion, I would question how realistic they are at all, but at least they are more connected to reality than the neocons who dominate the administration and who surround the president and whose visceral opinions the president shares. As I have discussed on numerous occasions, these neocons have never had a real proper appreciation of things like infrastructure, logistics, industrial processes, raw materials supply, whatever. And whenever they are confronted by experts who try to explain these things to them, they rapidly lose interest. This is because these people have been brought up for most of their lives with an assumption that there is absolutely nothing that the United States cannot do if it puts its mind to doing it. The assumption is that American power is almost limitless, and they tend to push back against any attempt to acknowledge that there can possibly be limits to it. So the result is that they cannot accept or acknowledge, and will not accept and acknowledge, the fact that the United States, there is only limits to what the United States can do. That the United States cannot endlessly rearm Ukraine and send more and more machines, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, bombs, whatever to Ukraine, and at the same time will find itself suffering weaknesses in trying to take on the Chinese in the Pacific. There's been, I'll just quote yet another defense official who's quoted in this article. He says that Ukraine debt drain has only exacerbated what Mackenzie Eaglin calls the terrible 20s, the effect of congressional squabbling, the delayed weapons modernization bills, which has left the military with aging hulls, aged chassis, hulls and airframes that cannot be upgraded with today's technology and cannot generate the kind of power needed to survive any fight. These include Eisenhower-era B-52s and Minuteman missiles that have exceeded their shelf life. It's a horror story. We can't put any more band-aids on a defense industrial base that has reacted to government signals for the past 3 decades and is now purely a peacetime industrial base. There is no more freedom forge or arsenal of democracy. Indeed, the Ukrainian invasion has signaled the start of a new era of industrial warfare in which Washington may have begun to cut into its own deterrence posture by delivering more than 10,000 Javelin anti-armor missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine. We haven't fired munitions at this rate since World War II, and air defense was not something we had to worry about for 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, so we took the eye off the ball. And they also take on the whole arsenal of democracy idea. They say that lots of people still believe Americans have always seen ourselves as the arsenal of democracy, and history tends to glorify the rapid build-up of America's World War II military in only a few years. We did it once, the thinking goes, against two formidable foes at the same time, Germany and Japan. So why would it be so hard for the most technologically advanced nation on earth to achieve the same thing against China and Russia? Well, one point I would make before we even proceed, of course, is that China and Russia have a much, much bigger industrial base relative to the United States than Germany and Japan did in the 1940s. In fact, China's industrial base greatly exceeds that of the United States. And anyway, we go on to read how in the 1930s and 1940s, there was a strong US manufacturing base across the board, from major automakers to mom and pop tool makers. We lack that today. Unlike World War II, America no longer has the skilled manufacturing base to spin up and support wartime production. So, this is what is concerning the Pentagon. It is what is concerning more and more people in the military-industrial establishment. They're starting to see Ukraine, in fact they're not starting to see, they have been worried for some time that Ukraine is becoming a bottomless well. It is absorbing American energy, technology, munitions, production facilities, depriving the United States of funds and resources that it needs in order to respond to the supposed threat from China. And I'm going to make a further point, by the way, which is that there's references, for example, even in this article, to the fact that Stinger missiles and javelins might not be the kind of weapon system that the United States actually needs if it gets into a confrontation with China, so it can easily afford, some people say, to give them all to Ukraine, because ultimately these weapons are not needed. But of course, the point to understand is that if there were to be a conflict with China, it's not just American arsenals that are becoming depleted. It is those of the US's own allies in Europe. They're now short of ammunition, munitions. It's exposed, the conflict has exposed their weaknesses in tanks, their weaknesses in aircraft, by the way. The fact that they're struggling to find aircraft to put together, infantry fighting vehicles, the poor condition of the German armed forces, the poor condition of the British armed forces, the non-existent condition of the Danish armed forces, the rapid depletion of the Finnish armed forces. All of these militaries are in very poor shape. And Europe, even more than the United States, lacks the industrial base to re-equip its forces rapidly. And as I've said, the United States needs every part of the remaining industrial base it still has left if it is to engage in an arms race with China in the Pacific. It needs every bit of the manufacturing base it already has, and of course it needs to add rapidly to it. And as we see in this article, that might not be actually possible in any realistic time frame. What the United States must worry about is that with an ongoing war in Europe, in Ukraine, if the conflict in Taiwan begins, or over Taiwan begins, and the United States has to concentrate on that, and there is a clash of titans between the United States and China, then its western flank, if you like, Europe is now disastrously exposed, with European militaries incredibly run down, lacking in basic equipment, lacking in machines and tanks and even aircraft, with the Russian military industrial complex rapidly cranking out more machines every day and mobilizing more forces every day and preparing to strike west, or being in a position to strike west if the need arises. And with the United States itself distracted in the Pacific and lacking the resources to fight Russia and China at the same time, you can see why the Pentagon is extremely concerned. Now, I've actually find this a particularly interesting article because before the conflict in Ukraine began, before the Biden administration even appeared on the scene, whilst Donald Trump was still president, I did a whole series of programs in which, on this channel in fact, in which I actually addressed this very issue. I said that the United States, having destroyed its relations with both of its potential adversary superpowers, is at high risk of finding itself faced with an overcommitment crisis. It cannot be strong everywhere. It needs to concentrate in one place or another, but because its relations with both China and Russia are now so bad, it cannot do that. Now, when the administration took office in January 2021, one got the sense that some kind of a debate about all of this was indeed underway at that time within the administration. There was an article in the Atlantic Council magazine, a very hysterical and frankly, I thought, unbalanced and even at times demented article, written by an anonymous contributor who was widely believed to have been a senior Biden administration official. Anyway, what this person said was that the major adversary is China. The United States cannot risk a two-front war, so it needs to make concessions to Russia in order to basically buy off Russia so that the United States can focus instead all its energies on taking on China. And then, as I've discussed many times, we got pushback, and there was an article, I remember, at the National Interest by Mr. Wes Mitchell, saying, no, we shouldn't do that at all. What we need to do is to weaken or even defeat Russia and gain control of its government and redirect its foreign policy so that Russia becomes an ally, in effect, of the United States against China, in the same way that Bismarck managed to make Austria an ally against France after defeating Austria in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. And entirely predictably, the neocons jumped for the second option. They are not prepared to make concessions to Russia, so they doubled down. They followed Mr. Wes Mitchell's advice, and well, we have the war in Ukraine that we're now seeing playing out. And of course, that war hasn't gone according to plan. The Russian economy withstood the sanctions attack, and the war is now looking like it's going to be increasingly prolonged. And from the Pentagon's point of view, this is the worst possible outcome. A quick Ukrainian defeat might actually be preferable. It would clear the air. It might allow the United States to come to some kind of understanding with the Russians about the situation in Europe, even if it's only some kind of unsatisfactory and short-term compromise. But a long war, which goes on for years, or perhaps more than a year, if that's indeed what is threatened, would be a disaster. It would mean that all US resources from its shrunken industrial base will have to be focused on trying to hold the line in some way against the growing, increasingly powerful Russian military in Ukraine, even whilst China's build-up in the Pacific, in Taiwan, and in all of those places continues and gathers speed. So you can understand why there have been a number of calls over the last few months to try to find some kind of end to the Ukraine war. Why people like Mr. Charap from the Council of Foreign Relations has written in Foreign Affairs his piece that I discussed yesterday, the piece The Unwinnable War, and why he's warning in it that the war, an unwinnable war, a prolonged war in Ukraine is contrary to US interests. It's dangerous, it could escalate out of control, and it risks getting the US bogged down in Ukraine. And now we have this article in Politico, and we've also had that lecture from General Milley reminding everybody that Russia is indeed, contrary to what perhaps some of the neocons think, a superpower. It's not a force that can be simply disregarded. So this is the argument that the so-called realists, the Pentagon people, the military people, are making. And you can see here one concern I immediately have, because of course the assumption behind all of this thinking is not that you can forge some kind of peace, long-term peace, with China, the assumption is that at some point in the next few years, some kind of armed conflict between China and the United States will begin. The argument that you actually read in articles like this is that the way to avoid this conflict is not to sit down with the Chinese and come to some kind of understanding of each other's concerns and perhaps achieve a long-term sustainable settlement of the disputes in the South China Sea and above all over Taiwan. In relation to Taiwan, in fact, the problem is even more bizarre because arguably a long-term solution, sustainable solution to the Taiwan issue was agreed decades ago, way back, I believe, in 1972, in a joint statement that the US and Chinese governments at that time issued. The point was that the Chinese, in that statement, reaffirmed that they regarded Taiwan as part of China, and they asserted that the sole legitimate government of China is the government which holds power in Beijing. And the United States, in return, said that it didn't disagree with any of this, and it also said that it was not in any way disputing that Taiwan was indeed a part of China and that there was a one China and that China was governed ultimately from Beijing. Now, that didn't mean that the United States was handing over Taiwan to China, and it didn't mean that China said that it was going to move immediately to launch a military occupation of Taiwan. What it meant was that the two superpowers, China and the United States, in the early 70s, basically agreed that Taiwan was an internal problem of China. The United States would not become involved. China would not seek to resolve it militarily, but the United States in return would take no action to try to engineer a breakaway of Taiwan from China. And all the tensions we have seen over the Taiwan issue over the last few years, but especially since this current administration took office, is because the United States has departed under this administration, even more so than under the previous Trump administration, from the original long-term sustainable agreement that was made way back in the 1970s. So the result is that the United States, in its usual way, as we see in this article, doesn't accept that it is the author, ultimately, of its own problems. Rather, it sees everything in terms of growing Chinese belligerence, whereas in reality, it has been the US instead which has provoked this conflict with China over Taiwan. So, as I said, I think the Chinese would probably be willing, if there was a genuine, sincere negotiation with the United States, to return to the provisions that were made back in the 1970s. They would certainly demand an end now, I think, to US military supplies to Taiwan. And they would also, I suspect, also want a public reaffirmation from the administration that what President Biden repeatedly says, that the United States has some legal obligation to defend Taiwan from China's attack, that obligation does not exist. And as for all the other matters, the South China Sea and all of that, again, provided Chinese concerns were understood, provided Chinese red lines were accepted, I think we could find our way to some kind of understanding between the United States and China, which would certainly stabilize the international system. But of course, No one in Washington is talking about this. The administration is not talking about this. And of course, the so-called realists, the people who are behind all of these articles, the Rand Corporation report in January, which I've discussed at length, co-authored by Mr. Charap. Mr. Charap himself in his Foreign Affairs article, another secret Rand Corporation report, which apparently goes a lot further than the first one, and which is circulating in private and which is supposed to exist. General Milley in his lecture, and then this article in Foreign Affairs. None of the people who write these things are really looking for a modus vivendi with China. What they're all concerned about is, as I said, the fact that the United States is drifting into a confrontation with China, even whilst it is bogged down in Ukraine. Now, I've said before, I've been saying for months, that there is clearly an argument going on in Washington at the present time. And if you think that this article that has just appeared in Politico, it's a huge article, by the way, about the lack of preparedness to take on China, and General Milley's lecture, and that article by Mr. Charap in Foreign Affairs, if you think that all that is chance, well, good for you, but I don't think so. In fact, I'd be tempted to say that I think I'd have, in that case, a bridge to sell you. It's the sort of situation where I think you can see that over the last few weeks, in the lead up to the Ukrainian offensive, the neocons have made the running. Now it's the realists' turn. What they're basically saying is this: look, if this offensive either fails entirely or only succeeds partially, and no one, it seems now, really expects this offensive to end the war, to achieve a decisive victory over Russia. If, whatever the outcome of this offensive, it is absolutely essential that this war be ended as soon as possible, preferably this year. We simply cannot afford for it to go on longer. We're all committed to this confrontation with China. Extraordinary though I find that to be, but in the United States, all of the leaders appear to be. And if that is your policy, what the realists are saying is, look, your attempt to engineer regime change in Moscow, this is what they're saying to the neocons, your attempt to engineer regime change in Moscow, to demolish the Russian economy, to provoke a political crisis in Russia, to break up Russia, to defeat Russia in Ukraine, all of that is not happening. And since we need to worry about China, we must seek peace in Ukraine. Now, notice that they're having, as this article acknowledges, great difficulty getting the administration to understand this. Lloyd Austin, talking to Representative Gallagher, apparently retreats into evasions. He won't answer simple questions. And one gets the sense that, in fact, it's straightforwardly said in this article, that when all these problems are explained to the inner group around the president, they don't seem to pay very much attention to what they're being told. This article that has appeared in Politico is, in my opinion, possibly the breakout article. Go back to the title. The Pentagon is freaking out about a potential war with China because America might lose. Freaking out. It's very strong language, stronger than any language we've seen from the realists up to this point. And Notice also the criticism, the direct criticism of the administration and some of the officials in it, not the president, that you find in this article. The references to Lloyd Austin not having answers, the references to other officials not apparently being properly engaged with what is actually going on. The fact that there seems to be an unwillingness on the part of the gaggle of neocons around the president to face realities. I would add that Seymour Hersh, through his sources, has been saying essentially the same thing, that there is more and more exasperation within the permanent government of the United States at the inability, or rather the refusal, of the president and his key advisors to understand how serious and indeed dangerous the whole situation from the perspective of the realists is becoming. Well, how will all this work itself out? I think a lot does depend on the eventual outcome of the offensive. If the offensive is successful to the point of capturing Melitopol, breaking the land bridge, reaching the Sea of Azov, all of those things, I don't think it'll make the Russians more willing to negotiate. But I think it will reinforce demands to go on supporting Ukraine, even if that means a prolonged war. If the offensive is completely unsuccessful, if it fails entirely, or if it only achieves partial success, captures, the odd town here, makes the odd inroad there, then I think it is highly likely that we're going to see a major initiative from the United States over the next few months, before the end of this year, to try to reopen the dialogue with Moscow, to try to achieve a peace agreement of some kind. And I discussed yesterday the Paris peace talks that ultimately ended direct US involvement in the war in Vietnam, but perhaps the closest parallel to that, perhaps the closest indicator, strongest indicator to that, which suggests that the United States is already perhaps at some levels trying to reopen some kind of a discussion track with the Russians, is that a couple of days ago the United States actually appears to have proposed to the Russians that some kind of talks resume on the question of limiting strategic nuclear weapons. The Russians, by the way, said no. But it does look like an opening overture to start some kind of talks. Whether the Russians are in any mood to talk at this time is, of course, another matter. But anyway, it does look, with this article, as if the concerns of the realists are becoming more urgent, and as if the vehemence with which they are prepared to express their concerns is growing. I have to say that I think if the offensive fails, there's a real prospect that we could see a major public row in the United States this autumn. Not this underground conflict that we're seeing at the moment, but a simple, straightforward, open row. Now, let me reiterate again, I'm not on the side of the realists in this issue. People I call the realists, I don't think they are, as I said, particularly realistic. I'm on the side of people who want a sustainable peace. I understand there are some people in the United States who have strong feelings about China. I understand that there are some people who have strong feelings about Russia. But these remain great powers, as General Milley acknowledges. They're both nuclear powers, and in military terms, they're becoming more powerful every day. So, given that this is so, the future of humanity and of civilization surely demands the doubts about them be put aside and proper discussions take place. That's the point that President Kennedy made in his famous peace speech of 1963. You don't have to like your adversary, but when the stakes are as high as they are, you have to at least make an effort to try to understand them and to understand that they do have red lines, which it's unwise for you to cross. Now, will the neocons ever accept this? Of course not. Will the rest of the political class accept it? Maybe. It's important to remember that the political class in Washington is not only made up of neocons. But what will happen, we will just have to wait and see. Well, as I said, that's the end of my program today. We'll see how this argument plays out. But let me reiterate again, for the moment, the big news is what goes on the battlefields. And there'll be more about that, no doubt, over the next couple of days, especially if the rain starts to clear. And in the meantime, just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember to tick the like button if you've liked this video and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Have a very good day. More from me soon.